I would like to get us all started here as folks continue to roll in and join us. Welcome to the BSA Housing Committee event today. We are talking about downtown conversions. Well, so two things are happening. And first, sorry, I'm Sarah Kudra. I'm an architect at Dream Collaborative. David, why don't you introduce yourself?
And I'm David Asher. I'm an architect at Davis Square Architects.
And we're the co-hosts of the housing committee here. So thanks to everybody who's joined us today. So we are joined, we have an additional person who's joined us today, John Wheel, with the BPDA, and he has a great program that he's going to give us an overview of as we get started here. And then we'll be going into the program with Cyrus, talking about live work spaces and for environmental justice and housing. So let's see. I'm going to first share the screen. Right, get all my tabs worked on here. One moment, folks. Screen one, share. Okay, so John, why don't you kick us off?
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you everyone for joining today. I just want to take a couple minutes of your time just to do a brief introduction, which is the BPDA and Mayor Wu are proud to announce that we're doing an office to residential conversion program for the downtown Boston area. Many of you may have heard about this already, but I just wanted to spend a moment and just sort of touch on the high points of it. It's really basically a program that's meant to be looking at the downtown area, but with 3 additions added on because we feel they're important. The Leather District, the Fort Point Channel District, and Bullfinch Triangle as well, because we feel that the building archetypes in those areas lend themselves well to conversion. And I think that this program is very timely given the environment that we're living in at the moment and the fact that we're really looking to revitalize the downtown area and turn it into more of a 24-hour community, while at the same time addressing some of the other issues ranging from lower occupancy in office and certainly the continuing need in Boston beyond for more housing. And so this program, I think, is meant to be sort of an innovative step forward, really hoping to lead us to getting traction on downtown conversions. I'm the senior program manager, and I'm in charge of this program, really working with all the constituents you can imagine, from property owners to developers to architects, you name it. We're looking to have broad outreach on this program. In terms of more of the details, it really is centered around one major item, which is that the city of Boston's offering a 75% tax abatement for 29 years for properties that are converted from office to residential. There are other legs to the program which are indeed interesting as well, which is it encompasses an expedited Article 80 process. It also has as of rights zoning if you're in the downtown area. If you get into those 3 peripheral areas that I mentioned, it becomes still possible, but just a little bit more complicated on the zoning front. And then the final piece of this is that there's going to be a potential to waive the fees associated with density bonus in the downtown area as well. So if somebody was contemplating doing physical extension to a building and having additional FAR, it would be possible to do this without having to do the normal mitigation that goes with that. This is meant to be something that we really want to have gain traction right now. We don't want this to be taking place in the future. And so as such, our time frame actually aligns with this. The program is going to be launched on October 1st with the application going live on our website. And then the application period will stay open through June 30th of 24. In the spirit of really getting construction going, this program requires that you'll be fully permitted by October of 25 with shovel and ground and construction beginning. So we recognize that this is a very tight time frame, but our goal really is to have this happen today and to make an immediate impact on the downtown neighborhood. I think that the webpage that Sarah's put up really is a fantastic source of information. It also will have the link to the application when that goes live. And as you know, Sarah mentioned, I'm John Weil. I'm here at the BPDA. My contact details are on the webpage there, so please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to have conversations and to answer questions you may have. But I think that's really what I wanted to cover today. I just wanted to make sure that you were all aware that this program is out there, that it's a reality, and it's something that we're very proud of. I mean, said another way, I think that a tax abatement being offered by the city of Boston is pretty much a historic event, and really, we hope a clear indication of our commitment to this program and our desire to see this become a success. So thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate having the time to give a quick plug to the program.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And we appreciate you spreading the word, because I think a lot of these things, the city is doing a lot right now, and it's
Yes.
sometimes hard to keep track of all the programs. And so this one had a lot of synergy with our speaker today, and I think is great to share. Briefly, I know this was a kind of impromptu share, but if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to ask now or pop them in the chat. John, also, I can pull up your contact info and post that in the chat if that's okay with you.
Sure, absolutely. Happy to.
As well as the link. I posted the link, but I will repost for folks who just joined.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Hearing no immediate questions, we will move on. All right. So up next, our program today is a talk by Cyrus, and I'm going to let you introduce yourself in just a sec. Talking about outdoor and work from home spaces as tools for environmental justice in housing. So Cyrus, I'm really excited you could join us here today. And as you and John were just chatting before we began, a lot of overlap with the work that the city's doing here. And I think this is a really opportune time to be discussing this. So I will let you, I'm going to stop sharing. Let you start. And as you get going, I'll put the link for AIA credits in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, as Sarah mentioned, I'm Cyrus Damubet. I'm really happy to be here to be able to share this all with you. And very happy to also see some familiar names and faces in the meeting. I'm going to share my screen now. Let me know if you have any trouble seeing it. Hopefully that's working. Cool. Awesome. Thanks. And yes, as Sarah also mentioned, there are a lot of synergies between what John was talking about and between this presentation a bit, but also our office generally. You'll see a little bit more of this later, but we were lucky to be part of the team that was assisting the city and the BPDA with the downtown office conversion study a few months ago, along with HRNA as the lead consultant. And so you'll actually see a couple of the slides that were part of that later as we kind of like transition the conversation from work from home spaces into their potential implementability in office conversions. So as a little bit, as you can see, I was editing my slides last night. That's why it says September 19th and not 20th. But other than that, this is very, very similar, nearly identical to a presentation that Rochelle and I gave. Rochelle Ain, who is an associate and here at UTL and works significantly in our housing team, affordable housing in particular. So very similar to a presentation that Rochelle and I gave at AIA, at the AIA National Conference in June of this year in San Francisco, which we were thrilled to be able to give there as well. Kind of the culmination of this research effort over the last 6 or 8 months or so. Okay. Oh, and here's a little bit of the necessary preamble. But I first wanted to just take a moment to thank the team that helped to prepare all of the materials that you're going to see today. It certainly takes a village everywhere, and that's certainly true at UTL as well. Contributions both large and small from a really great team of designers and researchers and thinkers, urban planners, architects, everybody. And we also did some developer engagement in order to get feedback from them and initial thoughts on some of what we were kind of putting out there. So thanks to the team from Scape and from Alloy for helping with that as well. More necessary preamble. So this is Rochelle and I. Unfortunately, Rochelle is not able to be here today, but so I will do my best Rochelle impression, though I promise you it will be sort of a pale impression compared to her normal liveliness and in particular, her expertise in housing and sustainability. I'm the director of research at UTL. I use the He Him series. pronouns. And my sort of project focus and project lens on this is really about equity in the built environment and kind of translating between urban policy and the kind of architectural form that things take. And more broadly at UTL, my role is about translating between the kind of individual project scale of things and bigger ideas and bigger questions in design, and how we are kind of impacting the built environment and communities at the biggest scale. And I'll do a brief intro for Rochelle because she was so crucial in this project. And she wears many hats. As I mentioned, she works in our housing team. She's a core part of the sustainability team here at UTL, and she's also the co-chair of the Carbon Leadership Forum hub here in Boston. Okay. Next up, learning objectives. They're on I won't read through them, but hopefully you'll get just a general sense of the potential value, impact from design through possible zoning policies and recommendations and incentives that these types of spaces could bring, and the way that they could improve equity in housing. At UTL, when we gather people together, we like to do a land acknowledgement. I don't know where all of you are, but many of us are here in Boston. So I won't read through all of this right now, but just because I know time is short, but we just want to take a moment to recognize that we're on the traditional lands of a number of Indigenous peoples who are still present on this land and who over centuries have shepherded this land. And so we're grateful to them and their ancestors, both past and present, to be able to gather together. And if you don't know much about land acknowledgements, you can learn more at native-land.ca. So a little bit about us, if you're not familiar with UTL, though I see a lot of UTLians on the call, so you'll know it well. We are a Boston-based and also sort of Providence satellited design firm, built like a think tank. We focus on the sort of relationship of the building to the city. And in particular, we think a lot about housing and a lot about cities. Housing is sort of core to our ethos, to our existence, to the type of work that we do. How much do we think about housing? A lot about housing. We, over the years, have designed 4,363 multifamily units, 1,676 of which, so about a third, are affordable. And increasingly lately, more and more of those units are FIAS Design certified, which is really important for the way that we understand equity and sustainability to be intrinsically tied considerations in the built environment. This is just one of those projects that is out in Pittsfield. So I'm going to dive into the presentation now, and feel free to just chime in if you have questions. I'll try do my best to kind of breeze through, so we've got time for Q&A at the end, or as I like to call it, Q and Q, because I can't promise to have the answers. But I think most of what I will spend the next 45 minutes or so doing is basically just reminding everyone of something that's pretty basic and fundamental, which is that we all need sunlight and fresh air in order to live, which is it's sort of weird to have done a 9-month research project that added up to something so basic. But we're going to revisit this idea kind of throughout this presentation as a way of sort of metering our understanding of how the built environment either precludes or enables that access to sunlight and fresh air, and what it can mean for our wellness, happiness, and the sort of equity of the built environment. This conversation, and it is intended to be a conversation, we don't necessarily purport to have every answer here or to know all of the things that we would like to know all the time, but this conversation really was inspired by housing and living conditions during COVID in particular, and the way that we saw those adapt, and the way that we saw how variations in housing conditions, but also in the real estate market around them, transformed the city as we knew it, and cities as we know them. So the sort of three parts of the conversation are the pandemic paradigm, recognizing that as a world, we all had the sort of most uniform change in our conditions that basically at any moment in human history, housing inequities that revealed, and challenges to our general well-being. Then there's the downtown dilemma, which includes conversations about the donut effect, downtown office conversions, as we mentioned, and the idea of a sort of new urban opportunity to sort of reframe how cities might be going forward. And then the last part is the policy prerogative, which kind of builds on that, about ideas for incentivizing implementation, how there could be, what kind of design guidelines might exist going forward, and establishing new normals. So as I mentioned, we all just lived through a global paradigm shift. Every city, this presentation was initially kind of made for being in San Francisco, but every city has a headline like this from approximately March 17th of 2020. And we all kind of have our own versions of this moment. We've never done this as a society before. We've never all had to do the same thing at once across the entire planet. And that the uniformity of that shift and its drasticness was quite interesting to us. And trying to understand, there were a lot of headlines and a lot of metrics and a lot of ways of understanding what was happening during COVID and understanding what could happen after it. But for us, it kind of came down to what is the role of architecture in not just fighting a pandemic, but also adapting to a new reality. And that included the realities that we experienced during COVID, but also the realities that we are ongoingly experiencing as the world continues to adapt. I think we're in an interesting moment right now where we're not far enough away for that sort of like retrospection as 2020 moment, but we're also kind of not in the midst of it so much that we feel like the need to kind of rapidly adapt to our context. And we're kind of in this moment of preparing ourselves to learn and to implement. So what did we learn? We learned a lot about rapid adaptation during COVID. This is my example of that. So I, at the beginning of COVID, I had a very clean and complete, as you can tell by the cleanliness, completely unused work from home setup in the laundry room of my shoebox garden level apartment in the South End. This is it looking pretty darn nice. And I never used it. And then a couple of weeks into COVID, being in that very small, cramped space where I felt like I could not go anywhere, I sort of gave up and I moved back home to my parents in Newton, and I put in this sort of weird sit-stand configuration. This is me many inches of hair shorter, whereby I had a desk at my window and I could either sit inside, or if I needed a break from that, I could go outside to the deck, flip the screens around and work through the window. And this, I think, kind of kept me sane for the first 2 or so years of COVID. And so I think many of us have some version of the process of this adaptation, though possibly we've blocked these early days from our minds. And so we kind of asked around the office for people's examples of them. There's Rochelle making it work at an ironing board, like you got to do what you got to do. And so these were the sort of early COVID desk days. But we learned some things from these photos. The desks may have been small and they may not have even really fit a monitor and a laptop. The monitors may not have been the best monitors in the world. The desk might have been a cardboard box on top of a windowsill that had absolutely no knee space. It might have been the monitor might have been a TV, but people were making it work, and some of the things that they were prioritizing, as you can see in these photos, were access to being outside or being near a window, having some fresh air and some sunlight, as part of the mitigation strategies sort of for what was becoming the reality of like just living in your office or home or whatever, bedroom or whatever it might be. And there's a version of this photo that kind of replaces that coffee mug with like a beer at some point in the day, right? But like even just being able to just work outside became an interesting option. So we asked for people for photos from later in COVID, and these are what we got. The desks got a lot nicer. The chairs definitely got more comfortable. Proper monitors, good setups started showing up. Dog beds, everyone got very comfy. This is actually me and my partner's setup at his place in Chicago. He's on the call right now. So where we work back to back in this really nice sort of like sunroom with lots of plants and lots of windows. So yeah, we realized these, no matter what else changed, actually these things stayed priorities throughout. And we were interested in like what about that is making it possible to kind of be better, to have a better existence in these spaces. Ultimately, we kind of learned that we prioritized the things that we cared about during COVID. So, there were a lot of changes in our lives. But there were also some benefits that we were able to glean from them. We lost less time or no time in many cases to commuting. Being able to get a load of laundry in between meetings kind of became like my symbol of COVID efficacy. Dinner was easier to get on the table by 6 for families. If you were having a bad day or a tough client meeting, you could just like step out onto a deck or step outside for a breather. There were shifting logistics around childcare, which often meant more time spent with family, but not always necessarily unstressful time. But within that, there were often better connections to family and to nature. We also, we baked a lot. There's my dad with his prize sourdough and the sort of like collection of office pets and happy outdoor moments from this time. So y'all may remember this tweet. I was seeing it online from around September 15th. This is sort of a summary of what I just presented, which is that, working from home can look like this, which is the sort of like the nice background and the put together jacket and all of that kind of stuff. But the reality can be that it feels like this, which is like sitting on chair, computer on chair, kids' toys everywhere, nice jacket, but that might be it. And this is the sort of like honesty, right? And so what we kind of got from this, or what we're using this image to say, is really like, what if we designed spaces so that they made this more like this in reality, right? So that they made the experience, your experience, more like what people were seeing of you on Zoom. And how could that help people? You'll see here, I think it's really interesting. She's prioritizing like really good light and being able to see out this window to what looks like a pretty nice backyard, right? And part of this is that we understand that work from home is in some form here to stay. I am in the office today, as it looks like many of you are. But work from home in some form is we think going to be around, and a fairly significant form. We sent out a poll, a survey that the BSA was kind enough to share, and some of you may have responded to. We should be really clear that this survey, it skews sort of white collar and creative class because it's just sort of being shared through architecture networks. But in that survey, 87% of respondents describe some sort of work from home condition as their standard. And actually, when I say some sort, I mean like 3 days or more. And so that's pretty significant. And when we were looking at data earlier this year, the numbers were looking that, about 38%. So, nearly, what is that, 2/5 of fully paid work days are happening as work from home days. And that in some places like the Bay Area, where the tech world kind of dominates in a different way, that percentage is even higher. And the other part of that is that, there's sort of clearer data here that the number of people working from home tripled. And while they may not still be the same number of, you may not be home all 5 days, it's kind of like staying around there, that there are like 3 times more people who have worked from home as some part of their life than they did a few years ago. So, all of that kind of that adaptation that came from working from home, my own ability to like the sort of privilege to just go home to my parents in Newton and like have dogs and a yard and a deck and all of those kinds of nice things, are kind of our privileges, right? And so we kind of started to ask the question, well, who really benefits from the ability to adapt and having the financial privilege to adapt rapidly and to integrate work from home into their lives in a way that is comfortable, pleasant, and good for their health and well-being. And the data kind of showed, we had an amazing research assistant, Avery Robertson, who worked on this with us, who read and summarized for me like hundreds and hundreds of papers. So that's where all of this is coming from. But the data kind of showed that the people who can benefit are by and large kind of like white, straight men in their 30s and 40s who work in tech. And so that's kind of like the same people that usually benefit from most things in society. And so we kind of identify there, a likely inequity in the ability to adapt. And we're really kind of aware of what that means, both from a sort of like general diversity standpoint of like who's working in these environments and who can gain from them, and also from the standpoint of what does it mean for how those built environments are created. And another way of kind of looking at the way that adaptation was and remains a privilege is just looking at housing prices from that February 2020 moment. So you can see that the rapid increase in the value of low and mid density rental rates and home values, as well as a correlated rapid decrease in the value of high density and CBD areas, rental and home values, understanding like this is that shift to the suburbs or shift to rural areas, or shift to entirely different lower density cities that where sort of the yard and the fence might be part of a more downtown sort of area, but not actually part of a really urban experience.
Cyrus, would
Yes.
you define CBD for us?
Yes, of course, Central Business District. Thanks for clarifying that. I know it now has two definitions, but that's the one we're using for architecture. So, and understanding that shift is also part of understanding that COVID revealed the city's systemic inequities and failures, and it's not like something suddenly broke. It's that we had something happen that helped us to begin to realize what the things that weren't working. And a way of kind of understanding that for us became, well, what does the shift towards less dense places or less urban places gain you? And it gains you access to nature, to fresh air and sunlight. And what does that mean for your for across a number of metrics? Being able to be in those spaces, what does that mean? Health, for your health and well-being, for your physical wellness, for your work-life balance, for your parenting and caregiving, for your carbon footprint, and from a sort of capitalistic perspective, from a productivity and employee happiness perspective. Like, people are happier when they're exposed to the outdoors. And so what does that mean for when they actually go sit down and do their work, or if they're doing them at the same time? And so we kind of, this is as I said, a sort of aggregate of information from across a vast number of studies, but basically we found that, being able to have increased access to light and fresh air during your work from home environment meant less burnout, psychological distress, depression, etc. An increase in your physical wellness as measured in a decrease in sick time used, an improvement in your work-life balance or parenting and caregiving. You can imagine like the ability to sort of like, be working a little bit and have an eye on a kid playing in the other room. An improvement in or a decrease in our carbon footprints as a result of less commuting, and also from again that capitalistic perspective, an increase in productivity to the tune of $37 to $55 as measured by net present value per square footage, which means like how focused actually are you while you're sitting at your desk and doing your work and that kind of stuff. So these are some of the metrics that we were kind of like tracking for. And another part of the understanding, like how can this be, where does this sort of equity conversation come in here, is that being able to work from home actually changed. Who can work from home really changed during COVID. We all remember those days of when all that was on the news was essential workers, right? And the idea that there was sort of a whole new class system created of who can and who cannot be safe and protected, essentially. What we were really interested in was the way that as a result of COVID, work from home became possible for many more types of people than previously. In many cases, for those jobs that we even sort of picture in our heads as like having a physical space. So for nursing and telehealth, for customer service, for tech support, for mental health services, like teletherapy is like a whole thing now that wasn't really a thing before, and even for education, in some cases, right? And then the other part of it that we're really interested in is the way that different demographics were opened up to had more equitable access to job opportunities as a result of being able to work from home. So people with different abilities, parents, and especially single parents, and people in rural areas, broadband conditions kind of being accepted there, may now have opportunities to work from home on jobs that simply would not have been available to them earlier, and that has kind of shifted even the income levels in these communities. So this is kind of like a key sort of metric for us to understand how has this changed, who can work from home and benefit from these types of spaces. And then the city as we know it has changed. This is sort of the urban scale question that we've been hinting at. These, on the left, you've got Boston in the spring in 2019, admittedly at the Trillium Beer Garden on the Greenway. And on the right, you've got Boston in the spring a couple of months ago on my walk from Utile to South Station. Not exactly as vibrant. The vibes are clearly not as good. I think a lot of this we know has corrected a little bit in the last couple of months. Summer has helped with that. But I think that we all feel that even on its best days, or maybe accepting the best days, cities are not quite the same as they used to be. And that's something that we're really interested in as a sort of paradigm for the future of the city. One way that we measure that, this is kind of interesting data. I know the text is very, very small. All that you need to be able to see is Salt Lake City here, Boston here, and San Francisco here. This is Q1 data from this year. And it measures basically downtown activity by understanding phones moving in and out of downtowns relative to 2019. So Salt Lake City and a couple of other cities have been exceptions. Their activities are quite high. Salt Lake is at 139%, Boston is at 52%, and I checked it for the last quarter, it's actually now at 48%. And San Francisco, the worst city actually in North America for this, is hovering on 32%. So that's kind of one way of understanding how much vitality and activity there is in cities. Simultaneous to this, there's been this shift that you all may be familiar with, that units have been getting smaller generally, right? Designed for kind of increased transience in a lot of ways. And there was this sort of blip of units that were coming on the market from 2020 to 2021, where there was a slight increase, 4 square feet, not very much, in units, but we understand those to be units that were designed pre-COVID, so there's not really a correlation there. And the trend since then has actually been for a decrease, in a continued decrease in unit size, and actually a more drastic one over the last couple of years. So kind of understanding that there's less activity, possibly more space, and smaller units. It seems like these three things kind of aren't lining up in cities anymore. Smaller units and emptier cities, another way of understanding this is that sort of donut effect. As usual, red means bad. And so this study kind of looked at how the net inflows in population have decreased over the last couple of years, and that cities kind of remain attractive to people who are sort of in that 18 to 29 range. But we're really looking at what does it mean to have a family in a city, and what does it mean to have an environment that is supportive of that, and a housing environment in particular that's supportive of that. So here you can see Boston and San Francisco, this sort of emptying out of the most urban areas and a shift towards the more rural and suburban areas. And why should we care about if cities are empty? I think we all on the call have our own reasons for this, as architects, designers, planners, urban thinkers, whatever you may be. We love cities. There's just something about them that is amazing, and not just for their sort of the qualitative aspects, but we know quantitatively that they bring value to the economy. They improve people's lives. There's so much research about kind of how cities are able to do that as these great collectors of ideas and of people. And so this shift, as you can see on the right hand side, of people towards small low density cities, it kind of bodes something bigger, a bigger question for our society of what would it mean for us to lose the impact of cities in the way that we've known them for so long. And I'll just, that top number there, in 2020, 16 million people left cities in the US, which is kind of a shocking thing to think about. That number has since stabilized as a rate, but we've not sort of begun that regrowth process yet. So as I mentioned, this kind of comes down to like, how can housing more equitably serve more people? Meaning, and in particular, like, how can housing serve more people for more of their lives as they become families, as their lives change? So we thought about this in that sort of like transience to permanence model, understanding the relationship of like light and air to those types of family units. So a hostel, we imagine, is kind of the least or the most transient you could be, right? You're there for like a couple hours. You probably don't even really need a window. And then the most permanent is like the standalone single family home. And we're kind of mapping like, who lives in these types of spaces. And that's at 18 to 29 range. You've got like singles and roommates who are doing the studio apartment and hotel kind of lifestyle. Maybe then there's maybe a partner that comes into the question, and the apartment maybe stays, but eventually it's a multifamily residential building and a condo perhaps. And then there's maybe kids that come into the picture, and there's a townhouse, and then ultimately there's like a standalone single family home. So our question was like, well, if we more evenly distributed access to daylight and fresh air across these environments, could you have people being willing and being happy to live in those environments longer, and being able to actually make a home of what might be a smaller unit with some of these qualitative considerations? We asked people, this was part of our survey, what do they want in their homes now? To understand this, like, were we on the right track? Was there a chance that people wanted something other than what we guessed? And in our survey, 70% of people preferred an in-unit work from home space compared to a shared or co-working or reservable space, like a sort of like shared common room or something like that. And 82% preferred a dedicated outdoor space directly accessible from their unit, like a balcony or patio, versus like a shared courtyard or roof deck or something along those lines. These we were kind of imagining a semi-urban environment of like a 10+ unit building as a minimum. And so actually, we'd love it if you could contribute to our data. If you wanted to pull out your phones, or you go on your websites or on your computers and go to slido.com and just type in 3251113, or even just scan the QR code. I'd be very curious to see your answers here. Many Utilians have taken this poll before, but I guess if you're on the call, you're allowed to double dip in the data. Okay, work from home situation, the majority of so this is that first survey answer that we kind of looked at. Most people are hybrid. Yep, that sounds right. Office only. Oh, shrinking percentage there. And work from home only, still 0%. Okay, really interesting. So 92% hybrid, even more than our data was a couple of months ago. Cool, that's great. We've got a couple more for y'all. The next question is, if you lived in a mid to large building, what kind of work from home space would you prefer? The dedicated in-unit work from home space, a co-working style amenity, or like a reservable room that's kind of available to all residents? Okay, interesting. Oh, it's exciting. Okay, that's great. Oh, shifting numbers still. All the respondents, 12. Okay, 75%. That feels about right. That's good to know. And then the last one is same question, but about outdoor spaces, as I mentioned. Would you prefer something private or something shared? This one can be quite polarizing, so I'm curious. I'm always curious to see how it comes out. I've had a lot of fights with my mom about this one. Okay, maybe less polarizing than I thought in this case, I guess. Uh, 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 uh. Okay, 75% to 25%. That's about in line. But I think that's actually the highest number that we've ever had for shared. So that's really interesting to see. Oh, even higher. Um, cool. Well, that's great. This is really helpful to have. So thank you all for sharing that. Now we'll get into the design a little bit. I'll try to go quickly. We're finally at the design. We've done the preamble. So, as we were thinking about these types of spaces, we said, well, hold on. We don't need to, start from scratch here. Designers have been, and developers and everyone who thinks about housing has been thinking about how to get this right for a while. And so we went back to some examples of what we've done at UTL to try to understand, well, what have we done, what worked, and what maybe didn't. This was from a project that we proposed in Arkansas for an Arkansas co-housing kind of project a few years ago, where we looked at occasionally integrating an outdoor space, but also looking at a workspace that maybe could operate as a workspace, was really designed as like a sort of potential catch-all space, so like workspace, bike storage space, art studio, whatever it might be. And what was interesting about this is that it maintained a lot of flexibility, but it wasn't actually really designed to work idealized for one thing. Then we looked at the sort of defined but not dedicated strategy that we proposed in a competition for housing in LA that was called LA Low Rise, where we kind of prioritized being able to have outdoor space. And this was particularly focused on the notion of a bad air day. For example, in LA, days that you wouldn't be able to drive, right? So if you couldn't drive, and that's core to existence in LA, how could you get outside if you couldn't go to the park or something? Well, you might be able to go to a dedicated outdoor space that was for your unit, and during COVID in particular might mean that you could get outside and either be alone or potentially have some engagement across a courtyard or something with some neighbors. And then also including making sure that there was at least one work from home space in every unit. The next approach was this sort of flexible nook that was actually from a project that Rochelle was working on at UTL, and this was being designed during COVID. And the flexible nook came away ultimately from the project, but everyone was kind of had it in their mind at the time. But as you can see, it wasn't really being designed beyond much of like this sort of nook. It was a little bit bare bones and had sort of limited infrastructure other than the space. And then the last approach is another project that we've been looking at here in Boston, where there was this kind of, the in-between space, like sort of just a notch into a wall that could house a desk, or maybe kind of like something that wasn't quite a room, but also wasn't quite a closet. And seeing how that worked. Ultimately, we were kind of told by the consultant that like this maybe wasn't actually desirable to anybody, and no one would really use this. And so we said, well, why not? Is it a design problem? And so our contention is that we really need a new paradigm in residential design and how to do these types of spaces. So I will bring us back to sunlight and fresh air, and the idea that these are actually human rights. There's a reason that solitary confinement is, against the UN Charter, because you're being deprived of these things amongst many other things, but that these two things are like, fundamental to how we live and how we survive. So with that, we would like to introduce not the work from home space, but the work flex home space. And kind of present this idea that you might have a space that could be specifically designed around the necessary parameters for being able to work from home, but that, yes, it could adapt, as some of those other studies showed, to be a play space or be an exercise space, but that the reality of working from home being here to stay, we think, is that we need to be able to design for it specifically. And so we kind of began to think through what the parameters for these would be. For the work from home space, there's an importance around being able, of course, having a direct view while seated to an exterior window, either in front of or to the left or right of the desk. That the desk should have, or that the space designed for it should be able to comfortably fit a standard 36 by 20 desk, including a chair, pull-out, necessary accessories, that there needs to be access to power, of course, and that this desk should fall within the very good daylighting zone, which we'll define a little bit more in a moment, but that's basically within 36 inches of a window, ideally. It can extend a little bit further, but we'd like it to be as close as possible. We also designed some outdoor space parameters, and a lot of this was taken or sort of like derived from studies that have been done in Vancouver recently, where they have parameters for these types of spaces, in particular for rental units and units that are focused on families. And the parameters here were that there should be a 6-foot minimum depth, which means that you could actually like have furniture on it and use it, right? Along with that, a 48 square foot minimum, which means that you could be outside with friends, family, and actually kind of use the space productively. It's not just like a space that you step out onto holding a coffee and kind of retreat from. And then we designed some parameters that were really focused on daylight, and you'll see that we kind of think about daylight in a little bit more detail throughout this. So north-facing units, should be staggered to minimize shading, and they should be what we call sort of outies. And south-facing units should be stacked, or can be stacked or staggered, but that they should be kind of proposed as innies, and that helps reduce cooling loads and glare. We studied this in a number of different ways. This was the kind of primary, the sort of first step. Should we, we recognize we're basically asking for a little bit more space back in these units, right? So we were looking at what does that mean? How does that translate? If we're looking at going, of the unit getting wider, we realized that kind of ends up meaning a 14% increase in the GSF in order to achieve the same unit count. So operating it first off of a 62-foot standard sort of double loaded corridor bar and 14 units, what would it take to keep the length of the building essentially and be able to fit the same number of units in? So instead we proposed going deeper, making the units a little bit deeper, and targeting a 6% increase in GSF without having to lose any units. And the way that kind of works is you can see here on the north side, those Audi balconies, there's no drastic change to the interior of the unit, just better space planning. And on the south side, there's actually a increase in the square footage here by a little bit of a notch created for that work from home space and sort of accompanying outdoor space. And you can see as we kind of worked through this, if you, depending on how exactly you went wider, you might be going, significantly wider, versus being able to kind of accommodate it all in a similar footprint. So we looked at a bunch of these types of spaces. They were all driven by kind of the parameters around the design were driven by daylight. But we also recognize that there will be instances in which the best scenario is something that's more internalized to the unit. And so the questions there become how to design that really well. But what we are prioritizing as part of the study, and that this space might also have different types of uses, but what we're prioritizing as part of the study is this kind of space. So these were their kind of daylighting rules of thumb. This was again taken from the City of Vancouver's guidelines around the very good light zone, which is essentially 1.5 times the floor to floor. So kind of, or sorry, of the ceiling height. So, the goal being to get the desk in that space. And this is kind of what that layout ends up looking like, where you've got the narrower, or sort of the less deep unit on the north side that allows light to penetrate further in, and the balcony just across, or just sort of as an outie, and then the slightly deeper unit where the light is penetrating deeper in anyway, on the south side, and that shaded balcony that actually helps provide some shading to the unit. So, this is kind of what that building could end up looking like: the staggered balcony strategy on the north side, and the innie strategy either staggered or stacked on the south side. We worked with our director of sustainable design, Jeff Geisinger, who many of you might know, to kind of model what the light ends up looking like in these units. And so this is actually the fall equinox, which is only 2 or 3 days away. So this is good timing. So, this is the base case on the left-hand side, where you can see it's actually quite bright on this side. And in the model, we kind of realized ultimately when we added these Audi balconies that there was not a drastic decrease in the light and the light quality on the north side as a result of these, but that adding the shaded sort of innie balconies on the south side ended up decreasing the overlighting effect, and therefore also decreasing cooling loads, and sort of improving the light quality actually a bit. Another way of looking at that as mean illuminance, it's a little bit hard to tell, and these are 2 different scales, I should note, 10,000 versus 2,000 at the top here, but looking at achieving a 300 300 lux is the minimum for, or sort of the ideal for doing work. And so this, this orange line is the base case, this blue line is the staggered balcony, and the green line is the stacked balcony on this side. And so what we realize is that, as long as your desk is still in that good or very good very good lighting zone, your ability to work there comfortably is not changed by the addition of the balconies and the outdoor spaces. We iterated through a lot of floor plans to get kind of what we were looking for here. So here's the studio floor plan, and you can see this is that south facing unit with the work from home space added and the outdoor space. And then here's the north facing unit where you've got that work from home or that outdoor space happening still in that the square feet that additional 6 to 7 feet, but as an Audi, and good space planning, making space for the work from home space. This is particular to the studio case, of course, where it's really quite tight to begin with. But as we kind of worked through 1 beds and 2 beds and different types of 2 beds and 3 beds, we were able to kind of have a little bit more flexibility with how that all worked. And so you can see here the sort of variety of options for adaptation that we arrived at. And these were our preferred ones. What was really nice about these, we thought, was that from a programming standpoint, it really felt like we were creating homes, and really creating spaces that could be lived in for a long time, that people could have families in, could kind of grow their lives within, and being able to, step out onto the balcony with friends in the evening, or being able to continue working from this space while a kid is playing here after getting home from school, those kinds of things being real advantages to the way that these types of homes would work. We studied a lot of variations. This is just to sort of prove how many we went through, and this is not all of them. But the nice thing about these is that they reveal a ton of potential variety, and that adds sort of architectural interest, we think. So I'll circle back. I know we're running short on time. I will breeze through. I'll circle back to the sort of like urban question. We know that downtowns are key to our vitality and to our happiness. And we also know that historically, for the last 100 years or so, downtowns have been based around the office market. And that is something that we understand to be changing. Vacancy rates have been sort of plateauing depending on your city, in that 35 to 70% of pre-pandemic levels of occupancy, not of vacancy. San Francisco and the Bay Area being kind of hit the worst, and Boston kind of being somewhere in the middle. And so a lot of cities are studying or have studied office to residential conversions. Boston, of course, being one of them. San Francisco, a great study by Gensler. New York, Chicago, DC, Denver, and Los Angeles. In case you're not sure about that, here are all of the articles that happened to be open on my phone at the time I was making this presentation about the shift in those conversions. So this is the little bit that John may recognize. UTL, as I mentioned, did the downtown or assisted with the downtown office conversion study for the BPDA. In that, there was looking at all the office buildings in an initially defined zone. There were 380, and then we kind of controlled for like government buildings, institutional buildings, those kinds of things. And the result was that there were like approximately 200 sort of standard floor plates that met metrics for depth, for having solid, healthy unit depth, and window wall exposure, which was, about kind of what we expected. And some of the ways that that's happening right now, you may have seen the popular 25-story Rubik's Cube article from the New York Times a few months ago, or a building that was actually toured as part of the AIA conference, or one in Philadelphia. This one in New York, I think, is actually just opened or just finishing up. That includes the courtyard strategy. And so we think that, legacy downtowns are going to really rely on conversion. One of those strategies is what some people have started to call the snorkel, which requires carving a light well through a giant tower. It seems awful tricky to me, but they have done it here, and addressed a number of concerns through that. But what's interesting is that these studio units at the inside of this floor plan end up fighting for what is ultimately a very limited amount of light and daylight. Many of them have just one window looking into this courtyard. And so in our perimeters, that's not really an ideal living condition, especially if you're spending most of your time of your life in that unit and working from home. So we did a quick little study, imagining a sort of like example office tower. And the idea here was that what if we took, instead of having that open space, which is not really usable, at the core of the building, what if we took it and we shifted it to the exterior to create those outdoor spaces, and then notched into them our work from home spaces so that you would have a relationship between being able to work from home and the outdoor spaces. That's them there in orange. And then kind of programming the interior that way, going from the inside or from the outside in. The result of this, we think, is actually like pretty interesting. And we kind of looked at this again, taking advantage of the fact that they're usually higher floor to floors. You get more light deeper into the unit, even if you set back the actual curtain wall. There are concerns and considerations to be had around composite systems versus, cast in place concrete, and how you would mitigate that, how you'd work around that, and how you'd work around thermal bridging. But this is kind of, we think that this can have a real kind of efficacy in the idea for how this would work. And we think that there could be some real advantages here. These are certainly, we think, would be more desirable units than ones that don't have work from home and outdoor spaces, and therefore probably more marketable. They would eliminate the needs for cutting a new courtyard. Upper floor balconies would be protected by the exterior structure of the building. There would be a reduced embodied carbon compared to new construction. You could capitalize on cladding and facade changes that might be happening anyway if you're having to redo the cladding of the building and being able to just pull the facade in. And the outdoor space would likely reduce your FAR, which could mean, for new vertical or ground level development opportunities, which could be really interesting if you're trying to maximize your FAR. So being able to reallocate that. And we had 2 cost estimates in the office at the time for comparable buildings. So this one was quite interesting, that the office to residential conversion, this is assuming a pretty standard conversion, came out to 400 to 450 square feet, dollars per square foot, as compared to comparable new construction was about 200 more. So it's kind of interesting to us. By doing this, I will wrap up momentarily, I promise. By doing this, we got to the reality that maybe you could, adjusting for the same things like depth and window wall exposure, that there could be 38 additional typical floor plates that could come into the conversation here. And these are on those bigger towers. And that in Boston, that meant 763 floors when we looked at what buildings these are, which is kind of huge. And this is particularly interesting to us for other cities, because in Boston, yes, we have this older smaller building stock that we can start working with. But in other cities that may not have this is actually maybe a lot of the stock that they've got to work with, which is pretty interesting. So I'll bring us back to this just to close out, the idea that we want to be able to bring urban vitality back to the city and help in those efforts that are ongoing. And this idea that by changing the dynamics around what's a viable kind of conversion, by integrating work from home and outdoor spaces, which we contend are inherently more equitable and create better units for more people, you could kind of fill up potentially some of that additional office vacancy. I'll bring us back to sunlight and fresh. Designing for these increases equity. And I'll just quickly mention, regulations and guidelines are not new things. They are, we've designed these kinds of regulations and guidelines for around pandemics and around specifically concerns in about light and air in the past. Vancouver, as I mentioned, has been doing that now. There are challenges. We hope that we've addressed some of them and hope to continue to address some of them. Some of these come from incentives for ideas for incentivization, where you might be able to swap privately accessible open space like balconies or like courtyards for individual spaces, or be able to gain a height variance as a trade-off for including work from home spaces. And that we think can create increased architectural variety and excitement. And building a better city, we hope, will mean including these things, and that they should be priorities for how we build equitably. Q&Q. we're probably out of time, but that's it. So there you
Thank
have it.
you.
Happy to chat more offline too.
Well, thanks, Cyrus. I just want to wrap up for folks who do have to
Yes,
head out
thanks.
to other things. Thank you for sharing this and for truncating it briefly at the beginning. And I think it brings up a lot of really interesting issues that we're grappling with in design right now, and obviously in life, like experiencing this ourselves and trying to understand, as you've said, as architects and designers who I would say love the built environment, understand really what that means for the long term. So if folks have to leave, please go ahead. There's a note in the chat about where to input your information if you need AIA CEU credit. And I think if we take just 5 more minutes for Q&Q, I like that. We can, that way we'll keep folks to a timeline if they need it. So anyone, I'm seeing some thanks for the presentation. If anyone has a question, either pop it in the chat or just come off mute and you can ask. I'll try to give folks a second. And, David, if you have thoughts too, of course.
Sorry, I muted myself. I was just going to say, Sarah, I'm also happy to have my info shared as John had his, in case people think of things later and want to email questions, that kind of stuff.
Oh, thank you. Awesome. Well,
and maybe there are no questions.
I mean, if there are no questions, I guess, I'm tiptoeing because I think I could dive into another hour of debate conversation about this. So I'll just sort of let the audience participate. And then I appreciate your comments, Cyrus. We can, if you want to be in touch, also you can reach out to David or myself through our information on the website. So.
Yeah, for sure.
All right. I think that seems like we got some quiet audience. I'm supposed to do better at just like letting folks chime in.
It's so hard to not, when I teach, I'm always like, say something.
Yeah. All right. Well, I don't know if y'all can hear the screaming baby in the background, so I'm gonna say I think this is a good amount of time for this conversation. Also, the recording is going to be available on the website, not for credit, but to review the depth of information that you've shared here. Thank you so much again, Cyrus. And this, I really appreciate the research that you and UTL are undertaking to kind of push these conversations in a more data forward way, in addition to just the kind of human aspect of it, like light and air, right? We all moved right to it, and to really think about what that means in spaces we plan is important.
Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, thanks. It was my pleasure. Yeah, please be in touch if you have questions, and happy to chat more anytime.
Okay.
Thanks, Cyrus. And I want to just say to the group, keep an eye out for more events this fall. And if you have ideas or other research that you've been working on related to housing, please reach out to us and we can be a venue for sharing those ideas.
That's the other one. I always forget the sales pitch. We're doing more things with the Housing Committee. Awesome. Appreciate it so much.